So the starting point of this lecture is the offer in 1947 to the University of Reading of the 300-acre Whiteknights estate by the Goldsmith family, in whose ownership it had been for the last 100 years. Its purchase was on very favourable terms for only £105,000, and J C Holt, in his history of the university, acknowledged that the acquisition of Whiteknights was the most important single event in the history of the university. The Whiteknights estate had certain characteristics which made it very desirable: its size, its relative lack of development, and its proximity to the town centre of Reading and fast trains to London. Whilst in the 1940s it was still possible to acquire small suburban estates of the upper middle class or minor gentry, these would not generally exceed more than 50 acres, land with building potential being quickly snapped up. Indeed, in 1947, the university was then based at a site on London Road on a small estate of under 2 acres, being the house and grounds of Acacias, the former home of Alfred Palmer, who had donated it to what was then a university college in 1904, and it obviously had no potential to expand there. Reading's campus may be considered among the most attractive of the post-Second World War British campuses, which raises the further question, to what extent is this due to its landscape history of Whiteknights in the preceding 300 years, and just as crucial a factor is the way the university has developed this site in the 75 years since acquiring it. Many people know that the Whiteknights estate was the scene of intensive landscaping by the Marquis of Blandford, eldest son of the Duke of Marlborough, in the early 20th century. The gardens he created were overlain onto a landscape that had already features of the estate in the landscape style, carried out by the Englefield family. Is this on? Sorry. Right. Thanks.
It was working.
Right. And this is a view of the mansion built by Sir Henry Englefield, overlooking a recently created sinuous lake. The Englefields having owned the Whiteknights estate since 1606. And this scene drew the not too enthusiastic comment from Horace Walpole: "There is a pretty view of Reading seen under a rude arch, and the water is well disposed." And this is a plan of 1756, which shows the lake and the newly made surrounded by lawns, which are really the start of making a park. And these were park-like grounds and a driveway that traversed the estate from the eastern side, where was the entrance coming from London, over to the west, which was the entrance coming from Reading. And there were various descriptions of this estate as a ferme ornée or beautified farm. Two of the boundaries, you can see, were planted with avenues of trees with rides, and the line of the belt subsequently survives roads. And another of the things built by the Englefields was the 2 pepper pot lodges, which still exist, and this is at the main entrance. Now, this is a map of the 1820s, and it shows that from 1798 until his bankruptcy in 1819, the Marquis of Blandford carried out what can only be described as an orgy of planting and a reordering of the estate, extending the area of parkland, increasing the drives around the perimeter, woodland, which was said to be 3 miles in extent, and enlarging the lake. Planting took place in 3 main areas, and it's easier to see on this schematic map, a modern map. So firstly, there was the partly walled botanic gardens adjoining the house, which had such features as the Linnean garden, a striped garden, the Duchess's garden, a fountain, a terrace garden, a magnolia wall that was 140 feet long, and numerous glass houses, including a conservatory 66 feet long. The garden was entered by a door from the avenue near a stone archway. The second area was the woods, where the planting had augmented the existing woods of beeches, oaks, and hazels, and was described as beautiful walks, velvet lawns, flowery arcades, rural bowers, exotic plantations, and gay pavilions. This had an American border, formal lines of parallel walks, each planted with single species, catalpas, acacias, laburnums, etc., and a system of intersecting paths planted thematically, path areas planted thematically, roses, heaths, American plants, junipers, and these reflected the huge number of plant introductions. They also cost him a great deal of money. The entrance was marked by a line of sarsen stones, also used to construct a grotto, and these were brought from their estates at Wiltshire. The third area, the new garden, winding walks approached from the house by an iron bridge, a series of walks passing through groves of different trees with a series of rustic seats designed by Papworth. So just look at some of these features. This was the trellised garden, and the shell fountain in the Botanic Garden. Another view of the fountain when seen by Loudon, still working 20 years later, and a rustic seat. This is one by Papworth. Another fishing lodge, and a rustic bridge over part of the lake. And there was also a folly, the chapel of Whiteknights, based on the idea that the White Knight had been buried in Whiteknights Park. And this is a view of the enlarged Englefield house with a suitably bucolic landscape, the enlarged lake and the bridge. And other views of that, an oil painting which the university owns. And this one of the lady sketching in the grounds. Now, the one of the Lombardy poplars, just go back, was from a book that the Marquis commissioned from Barbara Hoffland, a descriptive account of the mansion and gardens of Whiteknights, a seat of His Grace the Duke of Marlborough. And in it, she said that these poplars were amongst the first introduced into cultivation, although I'm a bit doubtful about that. But now, the Marquis had not engaged a professional landscaper, but relied on his head gardener, Mr. Jones. Access was permitted to the grounds, but excluded all but the well-off, as they were charged a guinea for up to five people to enter the gardens. Now, in the years from 1828, Whiteknights was visited frequently by John Claudius Loudon, and he reported what he saw in his Gardener's magazine. His comments were perceptive, and he found much to admire, particularly in the collection of American plants. Those were the magnolias, kalmias, rhododendrons, and azaleas. But he was critical that much of the planting had taken place on the wrong ground, pines in wet areas when they needed dry soils, and the American plants in dry areas when they needed moisture. In 1838, he observed prophetically, "It is to be regretted that the indigenous and common trees are not thinned out from the exotic, for in a few years a great number of the latter will be destroyed by them." He also suggested that the town of Reading should purchase Whiteknights as a public park. Very innovative an idea, but few towns at this time had parks. Now, the Whiteknights estate was eventually sold in 1839 to John Wright Notes, and the house, Whiteknights Park, was pulled down. And from the mid-1840s, there were several attempts to develop the Whiteknights estate as a building estate. In 1844, it was announced in the Builder that the grounds of Whiteknights were to be laid out for 140 villas, to be judged by George Goodwin and David Mercator, well-known architect, with a note that Reading was 1.5 hours by train, not like our lovely 23 minutes we enjoy now. In 1845, it was reported that all shares were taken and new roads about to be formed in a land of surpassing beauty and contiguity to the Great Western Railway. So this was a plan by Mercator of 150 villas in the Elizabethan style, which would be, and the layout of the lake would be retained, the wilderness and the wider designed landscape. By then, certainly Whiteknights Road had been formed and Wilderness Road, but this plan was never realised. There was insufficient demand for these types of villas, and the development never took place. Now, the landscape when purchased in 1849, the landscape in 1849, as shown, when it was purchased by Sir Isaac Goldsmith for £11,419, whereby he acquired 184 acres of pasture and 100 acres of gardens and woods. And Goldsmith, who didn't develop it immediately, allowed the estate to be at the free disposal of the inhabitants of Reading for many years. And here's a ticket for entering the gardens, for which you had to pay for the ticket. The gardens were open from 2 o'clock till 9, and it is expected that all persons will protect the plants from injury. The next development, Whiteknights Park, was a successful scheme of a completely different nature, and one that was ultimately critical in determining the level of development of the estate up to the point when the university bought it in 1947. And this is a detail of the lease which Sir Francis Goldsmith granted in 1859, a 99-year lease of Whiteknights to a Reading solicitor, Charles Easton, to develop the estate into 4 leases for residences, all with substantial grounds. And you can see clearly that still at that date, the outlines, at least, of the Marquis of Blandford's landscaping was still well intact, with the now called the Italian garden, which was his botanic garden, and the Chantilly gardens, where had been the wood, which afterwards known as the wilderness. So in the next 10 years, leases were granted to Easton himself for Whiteknights Park in 75 acres, Whiteknights for Alfred Waterhouse and Manchester Merchant in 73 acres, Early Park in 77 acres for Thomas Porter, a West Indian sugar planter, and the Wilderness in 59 acres for Henry Vyse. Each lessor had the right to develop another house on his land. In fact, only 2 did so. Charles Easton for Blandford Lodge in 7 acres and Alfred Waterhouse for Fox Hill, built in 28 acres of the original Whiteknights piece of 73 acres. The first 2 houses, Whiteknights Park and Whiteknights, were designed by Charles Smith, a Reading architect. And the initial Early Park was pulled down, and the second version was built by Alfred Waterhouse, who also designed the Wilderness and Fox Hill for his own occupation. Although on the outskirts of a town, these were essentially country houses of what in Luden's classification would be a first-rate house in a first-rate ground, a first-rate plot. with all the necessary amenities, a substantial detached house set well into its grounds, accessed by lengthy carriage drives from lodge entrances, and with sufficient land for a park, pleasure grounds, kitchen garden, and a farmery. No house was in view of another. All had sections of the lake within their lease, except for Blandford Lodge, and the lessors could keep a boat and build a boathouse. I don't know of a comparable development of an estate divided into 6 very substantial leases of houses in the country. And if anyone does, I'd be glad if they tell me, because I've been looking for such a thing. Goldsmith himself was anxious to preserve the special character of the landscape that the Marquis of Blandford had developed. And in a lease issued in 1867, he added the clause, "The said parties will at all times use their best endeavours to preserve the park-like character of the entire estate, and will not plant trees in belts or any ways that may obstruct the general views across Whiteknights Park, and shall not be in character with the general park-like effect of the entirety of that park, or do anything else prejudicial to such park-like character." Very legalese, but I think you can see the intentions. So just look at the individual houses. This was Whiteknights, which was built for Alfred Waterhouse, and one of his sons described the wonders of the estate after they moved into Whiteknights in 1859, and their lease included part of Blandford's Botanic Gardens. The grounds at Whiteknights were a constant delight. Exquisite cedars and other conifers, including some at that time, were rare and of considerable interest. The beautiful azaleas and other flowering shrubs made the garden a perpetual pleasure. For some time, we practically had the run of the whole estate, including a marvellously beautiful enclosure known as the Wilderness, a garden largely falling into decay, but still with its terraced walks, summer houses, and fish ponds under giant forest trees. Now, a rather amusing anecdote about the Waterhouse children. Family were Quakers, and the children were not allowed to play the piano, but they found a new use for the by now empty orangery, where they gathered as a family to sing. And this are pictures of Whiteknights Park that Easton had built for himself with its very characteristic cedars. And it was built either on or very near the site of the Englefield and Blandford house. And that's the back of it with park-like grounds. And this is the third house, the Wilderness. The garden at the Wilderness attracted notice in the gardening press in the late 1870s, when the estate was leased to the Hon. Mrs. Marsland, who employed a talented head gardener. And the Gardener's Chronicle described him as a man of intelligence and capacity to understand the prominent features of old whites and to improve the garden sense without defacing the memorials of the past. He created an unusual hardy fern rockery using some of the 104 giant sarsen stones that the Marquis of Blandford had transported to Whiteknights from the Marlborough Downs and had placed at the entrance of the Wilderness. By 1877, as these in many cases fallen from their high estate and presented a somewhat ruinous aspect, it occurred to Mr. Lees last winter that in these boulders were the elements of a gigantic rock garden or fernery, and therefore all were, with great expenditure of labour, carted into a hollow place in the pleasure grounds, surrounded by trees and shrubs, and there fashioned into a massive arrangement they now present. And this was followed by a lengthy description in 1883 in the same magazine of the 200 varieties of hardy ferns. Alas, no one thought to either photograph it or give a drawing of this wonderful, gigantic fernery. And a further description of the wilderness. The grounds are flat, and those of the wilderness would be deficient in beauty and variety, were it not for the grand specimen of many rare trees and shrubs that dot the lawn, and also the huge masses of rhododendrons and other flowering shrubs that border and decorate the extensive pleasure grounds. And the fourth of the houses, Early Park. And there is its lodge entrance off Wilderness Road. And the house that Alfred Waterhouse Jr., the famous architect, built for himself, Fox Hill. And he moved there from London in 1868, so his children could grow up in the countryside. That's the back of the house. And a lovely painting which he did of the view from his grounds of the lake and the boat that they had, which is in MERL's collection. However, by 1880s, he considered that Reading was too built up, and he moved to Yattendon, where he built another house. Sadly, that has been demolished. The names of some of the leaseholders indicate that the properties continued to attract persons, of means, both locally and nationally. Whiteknights Park, after Charles Easton, was occupied by John Carslake QC, then Julian Friedlander. And when sold in 1935, Whiteknights Park was sold with 58 acres, of which over 11 acres were the lake. And the description said in the catalogue, ideal for a city man, 2 miles to Reading Station, 40 minutes rail to London. And it named the local hunt, and because this was the 1930s, the local golf course. Now, Whiteknights, after the Waterhouses, was occupied by John Heelis, the Reading department store, his name, alas, no longer commemorated by John Lewis, which it has become. Max Railings, the director of GEC. Early Park was occupied firstly by Thomas Porter and by 1911 by Martin Sutton of Sutton Seeds. The Wilderness, which had been built for Henry Vyse and remodelled by Waterhouse, was occupied by Julian Goldsmith MP, then Mrs. Marsland, of whom we've heard. And Fox Hill, after Alfred Waterhouse, was occupied by Rufus Isaacs MP, Lord Chief Justice, and then Hugo Hurst, the founder of GEC. These are some pictures of the gardens during the time of the Hurst. A rather garden-esque layout at the back of the house, but a more modern interpretation with a herbaceous border leading up to the house. This is the first edition of the the second edition of the 25-inch Ordnance Survey map. And I put it in so that you can see how very well treed the landscape was. The red boundary is actually the boundary of what the university acquired. Now, some early 20th century photographs of the estate, which are actually in the MERL collection. This is the Shinfield Road entrance. And the archway, which the Marquis of Blandford had built as the entrance to the Botanic Gardens, and the wall of the Botanic Gardens on the right-hand side. Another view of the archway from the other side, and that also shows some of the estate railings, which very much characterise the estate and added to its park-like qualities. A rustic bridge in the Wilderness, and the driveway leading from the other side, from the early gate entrance, and remains of the chapel just on the left. and the stone bridge, which the Marquis had built. Now we come to the university, or just pre to the university development. So Whiteknights was not immune to the requirements for building and land by the War Office during the Second World War. In the early 1940s, substantial acreage was requisitioned by the government of the early park and wilderness properties. And near Early Gate, temporary buildings were put up as hospital for D-Day casualties, but it was never used like that. And we then come to, I think, what is the strangest building on the university campus. So during the Cold War, this building was put up as the regional base for home defense in the case of atomic war. And it subsequently got the name the Citadel. It was obviously never used as this defense, thank goodness. But in more recent years, it has been a rather unsuitable storage place for documents for MERL and special collections. So although the university bought the freehold in 1947, as we have seen, the estate was divided into the leases, which were unexpired. So initially, the university had to buy out leases before any development could take place. So between 1946 and 49, the leases of Park House in Upper Redlands Road, Whiteknights Park House, now known as Park House, Whiteknights, now known as Old Whiteknights House, and Blandford Lodge were bought out, and they were used as student accommodation initially, and before the university used them for other purposes. Alas, at a period when Victorian architecture was little regarded, two of the three properties designed by Alfred Waterhouse did not survive. The Wilderness was demolished in 1950 on the grounds that it had been damaged during the war by the troops who'd occupied it, and Early Park in 1962. But most of the lodge cottages were retained. So if you go up onto the estate, it's hard to understand why there are so many little cottages all dotted about. But they were the one property had 3 lodge cottages. Now, I just want to turn to the university's plans for development. They're a bit difficult to understand. I certainly have found them. This one is the first plan, which was drawn up in 1949 by Easton and Robertson architects. But it very much concentrated on the western part of the estate, as they didn't have Fox Hill or the government land. And this influenced an influence which comes through to the present day, where the development could take place. So the academic departments were concentrated either side of the avenue and west of the lake, with halls of residence on the northern and northeast periphery. And in this plan, they don't seem to have kept the old houses, but they had what now seems rather an anachronism, a parade ground, never built, a swimming pool, never built, and covered walkways between the buildings, reminiscent of what there was on the old site. And the problem of parking was addressed in different ways by different plans. This had a multi-storey car park by Pepper Lane. Soon afterwards, here's a better plan for understanding the estate in 1950. And you can see how most of the development takes place to the west of the lake, and nothing is put in for the area which by then was occupied by the Ministry of Works. Now, in a slightly different way of telling how an estate developed, I'm going to tell it through Mr. Pigeon. Mr. Pigeon rented a large amount of pasture land from the university because, of course, there were very few buildings now and no development had taken place. And The cows in the landscape added a suitable rural touch when the Museum of English Rural Life opened to the public in Old Whiteknights House in 1955. Although Mr. Pigeon was cautioned by the bursar that when driving his cattle in front of the museum, that they should not stray onto the grass verge in front of the museum or cause any damage. Mr. Pigeon gradually gave up pieces of land on a month's notice as it was required for building, starting in 1954 for the Faculty of Letters, opened by the Queen in 1957, for physics in 1959, and in 1961 at Park House, where they were building a new hall of residence. And a third site plan by Easton and Robertson, Preston and Partners in 1965 was more like how, in fact, it was all built around the southern edges. And in this case, the old houses were retained, and the car parks, which are the yellow and quite intrusive, were by the departments, not all around the edges. And the same architects, Easton and Robertson and Preston and Partners, did the Union buildings and also plant sciences. And this shows the development by 1967 of the various departments. Now, the landscape was not neglected, and in 1970, Gordon Patterson, whose archive is here, submitted a landscape report to the university and referred to a development study made by Bickerdike, Allen, Rich and Partners, which I haven't been able to find. And this is Gordon Patterson's plants plan. No Queen's Drive and seven multi-storey car parks around the edges. You might be able to spot them on there. But Gordon Patterson made this observation about the landscaping. There exists upon the basic landform a pattern of broad planting which should be conserved. The scale of the perimeter planting should be seen as a means of providing a strong three-dimensional pattern to the whole, enclosing both buildings and open space. The smaller parcels of woodland within the site are a ready means of punctuating the space within the overall enclosures, imparting a more intimate quality to it. Now, Gordon Patterson made a proposal of lasting merit was that there should be paths around the lake, and thus creating one of the loveliest walks on the campus. And there's another view of his broad sort of divisions. The stripy bits are the bits for developing for buildings, and the black are the woodlands. Now, another design initiative on the campus, which has been of great value to it, was the creation of the Harris Garden in 1988. Sorry, on parts of the outlying areas of the Wilderness Garden. There had been a small botanic garden formed in 1972 when the Department of Botany moved from London Road. And this was expanded to the design of Richard Bisgrove to meet the teaching and research requirements of the new School of Plant Sciences. So Richard Bisgrove was the Director of Landscape Management, and he decided that there should be a variety of habitats: woods, copses, damp and dry gardens, pond, a cherry circle, formal gardens, and experimental plots. And this is his design. Over there is the walled garden of the wilderness, and you enter from the top of the site, and you can see the various different habitats which were created. And it's now recognised as an amenity garden and much valued by the university, especially during the pandemic, when it was used by many people as their open space. And since 2010, when the Department of Landscape Management was closed, its maintenance has been by the volunteers from the Friends of the Harris Garden, and they have one full-time member of university staff. So in fact, the lady who's been leading these friends and their gardening experts is in the audience, and there's a friend of mine. In conclusion, I want to look at the university's development of the estate from the standpoint of the present day landscape or garden historian. Garden history was not a discipline in the 1940s and did not make tentative beginnings until the 1960s. So the idea of surveying the extant historic buildings and landscape features and planting, which would be done today, did not occur to anyone. As a result, significant details have been lost. For example, the archway, sorry, I missed this out, two views of the cherry circle in the Harris garden. So, for example, the archway, which fell down in 1950, was just not rebuilt. The stone bridge was demolished in 1962 after vandalism in World War II and replaced by the less lovely Friends Bridge. The Italian garden at the rear of Park House was built on for staff and student catering, and two of the Waterhouse design houses, as I've said, were demolished. Nevertheless, some members of staff were interested in the historic landscape and researched it. For example, Gordon Rowley did this study where he shows the new buildings superimposed on the layout of the Botanic Garden of Blandford. And obviously, they've just put them wherever they want to, without any recourse to what remained of the historic features. There have been some restoration plans for the wilderness, though, which is largely untouched and full of rampant rhododendron ponticums from the more lovely rhododendron species which had been planted there by Blandford. And a restoration plan in 1983 found the gravel paths with the stone edges and remains of the hexagonal fountain and remains of the grotto, which has been restored. So this shows you a fairly recent map of the campus and where all the development has taken place, with, as I've said, most of it concentrated on the western side, although now some of the huts, some of the temporary office buildings, as they were known, have gone and more departments have been put over on the east. Overall, the university's intentions were appropriate for the landscape. Sir John Wolfenden, the Vice-Chancellor, had noted the development of the park as the new home of a growing university is a considerable task. All of us who are engaged upon it have constantly in our minds the determination that we will not damage the beauty of our surroundings, but rather that we will, in every way we can, enhance and increase it. So I want to finish with some images of the campus as it is now. This is a modern view across to the Shimfield Road of the administrative Whiteknights house, and beside it, the old Whiteknights house, and the arts building, now known as the Hums building, on the right. There's another picture of the admin building, but with some lovely trees. So the university has carried on, in a way, the intentions of the Marquis of Blandford and has planted a very wide range of significant and rare trees in the grounds and retained many of the old trees. And that's my final slide of Park House, and you still have one of the remaining of the Blandford cedars on the right. Thank you.